Before we dive into today's episode, we wanted to remind our listeners of the next Big Idea contest, wrapping up in just a few weeks. While the category for practicing professionals has closed, the student category is still open until December 2nd. To learn more about the contest and submit your idea for what the next major city planning trend will be, head to www.bookedonplanning.com/contest. This is Booked on Planning. I'm Steph Rouse, and today I'm joined by co-host Jonathan Miller to talk about affordable housing with author Alan Mallach, who wrote A Decent Home, published back in 2009. So we're joined today by Alan Mallach, author of A Decent Home. Alan, can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and what prompted you to write a book on affordable housing?
Well, I've been doing planning or related stuff now for about, 55 or so years. And I think the first 25 or so, I was mostly focused on affordable housing. And that was really my mission. And even though I've gotten into other things, it occurred to me that very few people, I felt, and I still feel this, really understood what affordable housing means, what it's about, how it happens, how it doesn't happen, why we don't have enough of it, and so forth. So I wrote the book, and it was at the behest of APA, to try to provide a guide, mainly to lay people who cared about affordable housing issues, but also to planning professionals who are only partly involved in these issues, as to why is it needed, how does it work, what is it about? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And really provide a good overview of the entire issue for people who care about it, but don't necessarily know everything there is to know about it.
Nice. Well, thank you, by the way, for writing the book. I know this is it was an issue in 2008 when you wrote it, and it still is today, potentially even more so. I think you did a fantastic job covering the need for affordable housing right off the bat in chapter 1. You covered topics like the income rent mismatches, deteriorating housing, concentrations of poverty, hidden homelessness, etc., things like that. And I enjoyed a few statements you made in the section 2 on regulation and the cost of new housing. First, thank you for pointing that out, because as you say in there, they exist not out of perverse desires, but because they serve some widely valued purpose, an issue we run into a lot in planning. With all the attacks on regulation, I think it's definitely an important reminder. More importantly, though, you talk about how rational developers act without initiatives to focus on affordable housing and how the market forces work to push both up the price of housing and also keep it there. Would you mind talking a bit about that concept and the rationale behind it?
Well, basically, sometimes people tend to forget this, especially planners and community development people. We live in a market economy, or a capitalist economy. And people do things in business basically in order to make money. I mean, that's fundamentally what it's about. And when you look at the development process and the difficulty of it, the cost of creating housing, the cost of getting land, getting permits, and so forth, the entire system is designed to encourage developers to price the housing as high as they realistically can for whatever their market they're building for, because their costs are so significant. The notion that developers make humongous profits from development is often not the case. Occasionally, they get lucky in a rapidly rising market. But most of the time, they're trying to cover their land costs, their construction costs, and all their other costs. And that dictates a high price. At this point, for example, I would say in most of the United States, it's impossible to build a good quality, medium-priced, medium-sized house, say a 1,500 square foot house, for significantly less than $300,000 or $350,000. That is a dictate of the actual costs, and people have to appreciate that.
That has been a big topic here in Columbus, and just in terms of how much it costs to build the housing. So with those astronomical costs, right, to do construction resulting in high sales prices, you do cover the two different ways that affordable housing can generally be approached, right? Whether you go at it with the supply side or the demand side. And I think most people listening might understand the difference between the two, right? That the supply side approaches by subsidizing construction and the demand side has the approach of using payment vouchers. In what scenarios would you say these approaches are more effective or less effective, or are they applicable in all types of situations? Or like when would you want to use one versus another?
Both of them are important, but I would say demand side vouchers are more important than supply side in more situations. Okay, first, if you look at the United States as a whole, and despite the imbalances created by the pandemic and some of the recent trends, there are areas in the United States with a significant housing shortage where demand significantly exceeds supply. And there are a lot of areas where supply exceeds demand, or where supply is capable of expanding to meet demand. The first type of area, think about, say, the San Francisco Bay Area. Everybody wants to live in that area. There are extraordinary constraints on building new housing. And so there's a desperate need for additional supply. And of course, the cost of the existing stock keeps going up in proportion. So in an area like that, it's clear you need additional supply of affordable housing if you're going to come even close to meeting the need for affordable housing. That doesn't mean you don't need demand side, but you do need supply. Now, if you look, say, at the other end of this equation, cities like Detroit or Cleveland or so forth, where the supply exceeds the demand. In many respects, building new affordable housing in those cities, from the standpoint of the affordable housing need, is arguably even a flat out mistake. Because what you're doing is you're cannibalizing demand from the existing supply instead of reinforcing the existing supply by using vouchers. So aside from the fact that the cost of building new housing is vastly greater than the cost of providing families with assistance to live in existing housing where the initial construction was done at far lesser cost basis 30, 50, 100 years ago. So you really have to look at the nature of each housing market. And generally speaking, I think a voucher and a demand side approach gets better and more cost-effective results than a supply side approach. Because even in the supply side, so for example, you look at the main supply side program, virtually the only one in the United States today, is the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC. Well, that only subsidizes the cost of the unit down a certain amount. Poor families are still cost burdened by LIHTC units. If truly poor families are going to be able to afford the subsidized housing that we're creating on the supply side, they're going to need demand side assistance themselves. So it's not even an either or. You need demand side assistance across the board. That's the single most important thing that the United States government could do to meet affordable housing needs, is to take the voucher program or something like it and make it an across-the-board entitlement similar to food stamps or Medicare. Everything else is secondary.
So along those lines, you brought up the tax credits, which is, I mean, in the grand spectrum of affordable housing, I think a relatively newer thing. I mean, if you're talking about, the beginning of affordable housing, you do cover the evolution of affordable housing approaches over time, sort of a theme throughout the book that I was hoping you might be able to recap real quick, just for people who might not be aware of, where it came from.
Well, the idea of subsidized or affordable housing goes back to the late 19th century. And it has evolved constantly. So the first phase, if you will, were scattered philanthropic efforts, like some of the early projects in New York City or London and others. And it was soon pretty clear that that was a drop in the bucket that was never going to accomplish very much. And then starting in the 20s and 30s, and really in this case, enormously influenced by the innovations going on in Germany and Austria, in particular, as well as Scandinavia and the UK after World War I, the United States embraced public housing and the idea that government should actually build the housing for people in need. And that was the basic model, the dominant model, if you will, of affordable housing from the 30s, when the New Deal adopted that policy and passed the first Housing Act in 1937, up to, I would say, the late 50s or early 1960s. At that point, as you know, there was a huge kind of backing off from government activism after World War II. And the idea emerged gradually that it would make more sense to have the private sector actually build the housing, but have the government provide subsidies for it. And so the next wave was a series of programs starting in really with the 1968 Housing Act, when the government started providing low interest mortgages, 1% mortgages and subsidies and so forth to developers to build affordable rental housing, or for low income homeowners to buy affordable homeownership housing. Those were known as Section 235 and Section 236. And by now there's an enormous alphabet soup that I'm going to try to avoid getting into any further. So that model, for a variety of reasons, was not wildly successful, but the concept of getting the private sector to do it has stuck. In the 70s, the switch came to what was Section 8 program, which originally was designed to be both a new construction, a rehab, and a voucher program. Though after the Reagan administration came in, everything except the vouchers was gradually phased out. Then the next version, and it's still to get the private sector to build the housing, was the low-income tax credit. And this is an ingenious idea. People were looking for a way to create an affordable housing funding stream that would be largely immune to political ups and downs. And so the beauty of the tax credit program, unlike an appropriation, is it doesn't have to be renewed each year. It continues indefinitely unless Congress actively chooses to abolish it, which at this point it won't, because it's got a huge constituency of developers, nonprofits, accountants, lawyers, architects, planners. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry in this country. So it's essentially a similar model to the earlier ones, except it's now based on this notion that instead of getting the money directly from the federal government, you get a tax credit from the federal government, and then you go out and find an investor who wants to give you the money to subsidize the housing in return for that investor getting tax breaks on their income tax. Now, two other things have emerged. I think one major one is also the idea of inclusionary housing, which also looks at the private sector, but instead of saying, here's some money to develop an affordable housing project, inclusionary housing says, in effect, if you want to develop in this location, or if you want additional density or other things to make your development work better, in return, we want you to set aside a certain percentage of the units as affordable housing. And again, it doesn't generate as much housing as ideally one would like, but it's turned out, especially in strong market, high demand areas, to be an extraordinarily effective way of getting housing with minimal public sector outlay.
Yeah, we've seen that a lot here in Columbus, actually. We had an affordable housing roundtable and we took a tour of several projects that focused on that, right? Where like 20% of units or something is set aside as affordable housing, which is really nice too, because then from a design perspective, right, it sort of blends in with all of the market rate stuff. And which sort of leads into the next question, right? We know that there's been in a lot of circles, there is some pushback on affordable housing, particularly because people immediately just think of those public subsidized housing structures of the 50s and these, 12-story bland looking things that are just, these eyesores that nobody wants to see. But since we've converted to more of like a private sector approach, that really opens up that flexibility for design to occur. And you do talk about in the book how important a lot of these design considerations are. What would you say some of the most important ones of those would be? And do you think that if affordable housing was developed more with design in mind, it might help improve the approval process for communities?
Oh, let me start with the second part and then go to the first. The answer is no. I don't think design is a significant factor in the issues of we don't want affordable housing in our community kind of thing. I think some people may use it as a pretext, but I don't think it's a significant factor. I think the issues are social, the issues are economic, the issues are concerned about the value of their house, all kinds of things like that. And in fact, by and large, I would say under the LIHTC program that overall the design quality of these projects is not bad. I mean, yes, there are some dogs, but by and large, I would say it's not worse and maybe even on average better than the design quality in conventional private sector multifamily housing. From the design standpoint, the big design issues are not so much what the project looks like. That's important. It's got to look good and it's got to fit into whatever the character of the surrounding neighborhood is. That said, the real design issues are how do you make this an attractive community for people to live in? If you're going to have, for example, a lot of 3 and 4 bedroom apartments, do you have enough space for children to play? Have you set it up so that children and cars are not going to get in each other's way? Do you have some green space? If it's going to be senior housing, do you have enough place for people to sit, place for people to do things like gardening? A lot of thinking nowadays, there's some really interesting stuff going on, both a design and a service standpoint about combining senior housing with facilities like kindergartens and things like that, which works fabulously well for all those concerned. So design is only part aesthetics. It's part, and probably the larger part, is livability.
So from a single family housing standpoint, or rather, home ownership standpoint, you do talk about near the end of the book about keeping affordable housing affordable. So one method that we've seen for lower income home ownership opportunities is building in equity restrictions on affordable housing, right? So meaning that when they go to leave that particular home, that there's limits on the return that the owner can receive in order to ensure that the home is sold to other low income households. What is your take on restricting equity practices? And is it possible, because I've heard this argument made a few times, that restricting equity can be a negative thing in that it ensures that low-income households don't receive the same type of homeownership benefits as, we'll say, for lack of a better word, traditional homeowners?
It's a complicated issue, but I think there's a very important underlying issue here, and it applies to rentals in some respects as well, which is the question, if you're building affordable housing today, are you building it under the assumption that it should become market housing at some point 20, 30 years down the road, which kind of carries with it the implicit assumption that there will be less need for affordable housing 20 years from now, or that somehow we'll have solved the problem? Or do you say, look, affordable housing it's a constant. It's an ongoing reality that there will be a need for affordable housing in this country as long as we have a country and the economic system that we have today. In which case, you have to start thinking about how do we keep the housing that we're building today affordable on a long-term basis? So I think that's really a critical policy issue. The second issue is affordable home ownership projects typically provide affordable home ownership at a deep subsidy relative to the market price. So let's say a family is getting a house, they're buying a house for $150,000 that would have cost them, say, $250,000 or $300,000 on the private market. So essentially what they're doing is they are getting, in return, they're getting a massive subsidy. And because of that subsidy, they're getting protection against ever becoming underwater or losing whatever equity they have to begin with. So essentially, I see equity restrictions as a legitimate quid pro quo in that context. They're getting this substantial upfront benefit, and it is very substantial. And in return, what we're saying when we provide these limitations is, in return, you will accept a limited return on the equity that you do have if and when you sell it. Now, the short answer is it does limit potentially the wealth building. On the other hand, it provides opportunity to become a homeowner in an environment where without the subsidy, you wouldn't have had a shot. And it is protecting you against the downside of homeownership, which is very real, as witness everything that happened after the mortgage crisis. So I think it's a legitimate and reasonable trade-off. And the other interesting thing is from the standpoint of equity appreciation. Remember, these families are typically putting in very small down payments, very small money of their own. So if you get, let's say you buy a house at $150,000, and after 10 years at 2-3%, whatever it is, you can sell it for, let's say, $200,000 or $180,000. But your initial equity investment was probably maybe $5,000, $7,500. So that's not bad. And bear in mind, if that family were to be able to sell the house on the private market, essentially what they're doing is not so much getting the equity, an equity appreciation, as privatizing the public sector contribution that went into that house in the first place.
Yeah, that's a really good point. See, you had mentioned the mortgage crisis and how a lot of the equity restrictions have helped put people in homeownership opportunities after that. So this book was written in 2008 in the midst of the recession that was caused by the housing bubble. Do you see any potential warning signs or similarities between that and then the housing crisis that we are currently dealing with today?
Some similarities, but more differences than similarities. I think what happened between 2020 and now was a unique situation. In contrast to the mortgage crisis of 07, 08, 09 was driven overwhelmingly by speculation and by the metastasization, if you will, of the subprime lending industry. If you have a pulse, we'll give you a loan. And, there was a huge proliferation of just toxic mortgage products, which almost guaranteed that families would go into foreclosure and lose their homes. By contrast, the recent situation was driven by an amazing trifecta, if you will. The first thing is, and frankly, nobody, myself included, anticipated this, the pandemic actually triggered a dramatic increase in demand for housing, as distinct from the slowdown that most people expected. Number two was it simultaneously, for, a variety of factors, meant that simultaneously you had the lowest mortgage interest rates in modern American history. Number three, leading up to the pandemic, housing production had consistently lagged behind demand for years. So you had a explosion just waiting to happen. And that's exactly what happened. With a shortage of supply and a dramatic increase in demand happened simultaneously. Now, I think it's clearly slowing down already, and people are already starting to predict that prices are going to start to drop in many markets because the rate of increase was unsustainable, and the increase in mortgage interest rates has put a substantial damper on demand. But fortunately, you do not have the toxic mortgage products in the market the way you did back in 07, 08, 09. You do not have comparable levels of speculation going on. So I think we are going to see, certainly the rate of increase is already slowing down. There may be actual price declines in some markets, but I do not see anything resembling a crash the way we saw 15 years ago.
Well, here's the hoping for that.
Yeah. Oh, and another factor is that because of the magnitude of the price decline and the toxic mortgage products, millions and millions of homeowners found themselves underwater, which meant that they owed more on their mortgage than the value of their house. That's a recipe for people saying, the hell with it, I'm out of here. Now, that's very rare. Homeowners have equity they are going to want to protect. And so they're going to fight very hard to stay out of foreclosure rather than just let it happen.
So as a follow-up to that, if you were to rewrite the book today or release a new edition, make updates, what elements would you be sure to include or remove based on some of what we've seen and learned since then?
Gosh, now I haven't gone back over it with a fine-tooth comb to figure it out, but I'm sure there are lots. Number one, I would put much greater emphasis on the importance of addressing the demand side and providing housing vouchers or the equivalent as a universal entitlement for low-income people who cannot afford decent housing on the current market. The more I've thought about it, the more I've researched it and so forth, the more critical I think that is. And I would take it a step further. I would make a prediction. Until or unless the federal government decides to do that, we are never going to solve the affordable housing crisis in this country, and we are never going to solve the homelessness crisis in this country, because the ability to provide that kind of demand side assistance is absolutely essential if we're ever going to hope to solve the dual crises of affordable housing and homelessness. And I would hit that point home far harder than I did then. That's the biggest one. I would also look more closely, I address it to some extent, but I would look more closely at the relationship between affordable housing, neighborhood revitalization, neighborhood destabilization, and so forth. It's a complicated issue, and I think it really needs to be addressed, because I think, the fact that we still have, despite everything, policies that tend to concentrate affordable housing in low-income neighborhoods of struggling cities is a serious problem. Another issue, I think, I talked about exclusionary zoning in my book, but I talked about it essentially in the context of excluding affordable housing, as distinct from in the context of the broad issue of housing supply. And I think one thing, this is a fascinating process to see how this has emerged in the last 5-10 years at most, is the recognition of the importance of overall housing supply to meeting this problem. I mean, if you artificially constrain housing supply and make it impossible or difficult to build the amount of housing that people need, you're going to have affordable housing problems no matter what you do on the other end. And I think people are realizing this, and I think people are starting to look very critically at land use regulations, for example, as a significant factor in constraining housing supply. Now, I think a lot of what's being said and written on the subject is misguided, but I think the focus on the underlying issue is critically important.
No, I couldn't agree more. I did want to ask you a more philosophical question that I've recently been wondering. There's a lot of talk, right, about affordable housing and what we can do and different methods to, bring down the cost and make it more affordable. But what I haven't necessarily heard a lot of discussion on is, what is the purpose of affordable housing? Is it to provide shelter to populations who couldn't afford it otherwise, even if it means pushing their budgets to the limit by using, like a 30% rule type thing? Or is it to assist in stabilizing households so that they could eventually escape the poverty that has led them to need affordable housing? In your opinion, what is the overall purpose of having affordable housing?
I start from a very basic philosophical position, which is that in a wealthy society, a wealthy economy, every family and individual should be able to live in decent housing that they can afford in a decent neighborhood. To me, that's like a fundamental credo. Now, it starts out with, does every family have a place they can call their home, which meets minimum decent standards of being healthy, safe, and livable? Doesn't have to be beautiful, doesn't have to be a McMansion. Is it healthy and safe and livable? And I think that's a threshold. And there are millions of families in the United States who can't say that they have that. The second thing is they have to be able to afford it. That doesn't mean it has to be only pennies, but they have to be able to afford it. So once they've paid their rent or their mortgage or their taxes, they have enough left over for the basic necessities of life and at least some kind of a basic cushion for the future. And the fact is, the great majority of poor and near poor people aren't paying 30% of their income for rent. They're paying 40%, 50%, 60%. Millions of poor families live on this thin edge of they've figured out how to make their rent as long as nothing else goes wrong in their lives. And if anything goes wrong, and that can be child falls off, breaks her leg, has to go to the hospital, the car breaks down, needs a new carburetor or whatever, everything goes crash. That's why we have an eviction crisis in this country. It's not because of gentrification. Gentrification is a tiny blip on the horizon. It's because millions of families live in ways that guarantee housing insecurity. So I think security, economic security is critical. And you can only do that if families can find decent housing that does not cost so much that they're forced into economic insecurity. Now, one hopes this will provide a springboard for opportunity and for moving out of poverty. And that's where I think the more you can create economically integrated environments and the more you can provide housing in areas of opportunity, the better shot people will have in that respect. But I think the threshold is decent quality housing and basic economic security.
No, I think that is perfect. As someone who has lived on that razor thin edge before, that rings all too true. And I know it really is an issue most, if not all places in the United States.
Yeah. And the tragedy is, and this is something people don't really appreciate. Let's say you're a landlord in Detroit, or you buy a house and you want to rent it out. What you find is that what you might call the structural cost to the landlord to make that unit available at the lowest price that he or she can do so and still make a decent return on their equity investment is far more than a low-income tenant can afford without falling into that thin edge of insecurity. I call it a structural gap between what poor people can afford and the lowest cost in the cheapest environment that you can provide housing for. And the only solution is for the government, and it really has to be the federal government in terms of the realistic financial capacities that are out there, is to make up that difference.
So with all of this in mind, what is the most important thing that you think listeners and readers should take away from your book?
I think that the most important thing is that I think we have to think of affordable housing in very practical, non-ideological terms, but as a question of how do we provide what should be every family's right, and how do we do it in a way that is cost effective, that is responsible, and that works. And I think if we just sort of sat down and said, how do we do that? Then I think we could conceivably even accomplish it. I mean, it's certainly a possible goal. So I think the key thing is to get people to think about how can we actually do this and what would it take? Because I think it's certainly incredibly important. And this affects the lives of tens of millions of people in this country. And so far, we're not doing a great job.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up this episode. Alan, I want to thank you for joining us on the podcast today to talk about affordable housing and everything that went into writing your book, A Decent Home.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.